The college is very lucky, very fortunate to have a very distinguished academic and somebody who's very acutely aware of policy at its helm. Martin Marshall was elected Chair of College Council at the end of last year and has already proved his mettle in the chair over the opening few months of his chairmanship. And he's going to talk to us appropriately in this research conference about the importance and the value of research in moving the NHS forward in the future. The value of research evidence, and research policy. So Martin, a warm welcome, and thank you very much for finding the time to address us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger, and welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to see you here, and thank you for coming out at what is quite a difficult time. I have to say my life is completely preoccupied with COVID, and I suspect will be so even more over the next few weeks. So being able to talk about something other than COVID for the next 20 minutes is a bit of life relief. In fact, it's maybe even a bit of therapy for me. So thank you for allowing me to do so. So I've been asked to talk about the importance of research in taking the NHS into the next decade. And it's, in many ways, it's an easy ask because the answer is it's important. I could stop there, I guess, in many ways. It's fundamentally important. It's exceptionally important that what we do in the NHS is based on good research. But there is a but. There's a big but, and that's what I want to talk about today. So we know that research is fundamentally important for us as scientists, as clinicians, as professional leaders, and as innovators. So as health professionals, we're trained in the scientific disciplines. We're committed to using evidence in everything that we do. Indeed, a defining feature of us as professionals is that we create and utilize new knowledge. That's what we're here for. That's why we're called professionals. So it's fundamentally important. As clinicians, of course, we want to know what clinical interventions work. We want to know which ones don't work. We want to know what their side effects are. We want to know whether what we're being asked to do is better than what we're currently doing. So in every way, research is important to us there as well. As professionals, of course, we're responsible for the environment, the organisational environment, the clinical environment that we work in as well. And again, we want to know what improves systems, which policies are good ones, which policies are bad ones, what the unintended consequences, the side effects of those might be. So again, these are all evidence and research questions. And as innovators, we want to know what innovations work, of course, as well. You know, we want to know whether artificial intelligence is going to deliver the promises that it suggests it might do so. We want to know whether polygenic screening is as exciting as we're told by many of the genetic advocates as it appears that it might be. We want to know whether really interesting innovations, like, have you heard the latest one? 3D printed livers. 3D printed livers are being developed right now. We want to know whether 3D printed livers are going to change the lives of people who've got hepatic problems. So it's an easy question to answer. Is research important for the next decade? Of course it is. It's exceptionally important. But the best predictor of the future is the past. So maybe it's helpful to question the extent to which the practice of research has lived up to its promise. How effective has research been? How effectively has it developed over the 30 years plus that I've been practicing as a clinician? I've got no doubt on one side that it's developed an enormous amount. We're in a very different place from 1990 when I first decided it might be a bit of fun to do some research. And I have to say that was an entirely opportunistic and impulsive decision. I'd finished my GP training. I'd been offered a part-time partnership in my practice I was training in Exeter. It was going to go full-time, and 2 or 3 years later when the senior partner retired. And the question was, how am I going to fill my time? So I accidentally fell into a research project. And I quickly discovered that I loved it, particularly loved social science research, having previously thought that research was unbelievably boring because I did a research project in a laboratory when I was doing an immunology BSc as part of my students. So I discovered exciting research, and it was unbelievably exciting, I have to say. It was such a wonderful thing to be able to do as a clinician. In comparison with 30 years ago, we've seen dramatic and exciting improvements in research methods. We're now able to bring much more funding into research than we were 30 years ago. We've got much better career training, much better career structure. We've got better research infrastructure underpinning what we do. We've got a more professional approach to information governance and research governance, a much better approach towards the detection of research fraud. We're getting better and better at involving patients in our research. We're better at understanding the importance of intellectual property. We've seen a growth in university departments, and we've got some of the best university departments in the world in the UK. We've seen professionalisation of funders, professionalisation of journals like the BJGP. We see massive incentives through the Research Excellence exercise in universities to produce high-quality research. And most recently, we've been increasing the emphasis that we're placing, and I think this is the most important thing, on the impact of and influencing of the work that we do. 30 years ago, an amazing guy called Julio Frenk, who is a social scientist at Harvard, he was previously Minister of Health in Mexico, said that we had a history of science, a sociology of science, a philosophy of science, but not a science of science. We didn't know how effective research was. We didn't know what impact research was having. And I have to say that now we've got a better idea than we used to have 30 years ago. So by almost every measure, research seems to me to be in a much better place than it was 30 years ago. But is it? And I'm not entirely sure. When I started my research career, research was a much more inclusive and much more egalitarian activity than it is now. It was something that most clinicians had an opportunity to engage with. Where I practiced in Exeter, we had a local academic department that worked hard to engage its local practices and to support them. The model was not a university at the centre, but a practice-based set of activities using a scheme that was designed actually by the college, led by Dennis Pereira Gray, of research-based practices. In my practice is one of 9 practices across Devon, which had a small infrastructure funding and integrated research into practice activity. We talked about research at most coffee meetings that we had, at every practice meeting that we had. We supported a health visitor, 2 of our practice nurses and 3 of our GPs to do higher degrees. We published in journals. Research was really fun. It was a stimulating professional responsibility. Some people might argue that this devolved local model of research doesn't change the world, although I might argue whether research ever changes the world, given that knowledge creation is an incremental process. But it did change our world, it did change my world, and I think there's many researchers of my generation and my peer group who wouldn't have gone into research if this local permissive environment hadn't existed. But then 20 years ago, research started to become centralised, it started to become professionalised, it became monopolised by universities. It became an elite and exclusive activity. Scientific rigour trumped practical relevance. The divide between pointy-headed academics working in universities and practitioners working in the front line got deeper and wider. We heard more and more people talking about proper GPs, meaning ones that spent most of their time seeing patients, and I assume improper GPs, like me, who spent most of their time detached from reality. And that's essentially where we are now, it seems to be. I'm proud to be a clinical academic, but in my role as chair of the college, a lot of my colleagues encourage me to talk about my clinical experience, but not to talk about my academic experience, because academics are not perceived to add value to general practice in the way that clinicians do. So let me explore some of the stereotypes that we hear about. There's a story about a well-respected NHS manager who was very keen on balloon flying. And one afternoon he decided to go out on a balloon flight. He had an important meeting with a colleague later that day, so he was in a hurry. But as he was up there in the balloon floating across the beautiful countryside, he got lost in his thoughts, and he suddenly realised he was completely unaware of where he was. Way down on the ground below him, he saw somebody walking their dog, so he lost altitude to get within hailing distance and said, "Excuse me, I'm terribly sorry. I've got myself hopelessly lost. Can you tell me where I am?" And the person on the ground said, "Yes, of course I can. You're 10 metres off the ground, you're 52 degrees lateral, and you're -1 degree longitudinal." And the balloonist said, "You must be a researcher." And the person on the ground said, "Well, I am actually, yes. How did you know?" And the balloonist said, well, everything you told me is factually correct, but completely useless. I asked you a simple question, and all you give me is lots of data. I've lost altitude in order to have this conversation with you, and I'm now in a worse position than I was before I asked the question. And the person on the ground said, you must be an NHS manager. And the balloonist said, well, yeah, I am actually, yes. How did you know that? And the person on the ground said, well, you don't know where you are or where you're going, and you don't seem to have any instruments to help you to get there. You've got to the position that you're in with the help of a lot of hot air. You've made a commitment to a colleague that you're unable to keep, and now you're trying to blame me for the predicament you've got yourself into. So practitioners and academics seem to me to reside in very different worlds. As an academic, I value my detailed expert knowledge in the area that I research, in my narrow field of research, my ability to bring in grants, my ability to publish in leading journals, my belief that the more rigorous my research is, the more impact it will have, and my commitment to producing research that is generalizable. As a clinician, I value a different body of expert knowledge. My ability to be pragmatic, to be quick in my decision-making, my focus on what matters to my patients and what matters to the communities I'm serving. My norms and rewards, internal and external, are very different in the two worlds that I occupy. Just the origin of the word academia is interesting. In ancient times, academe was a small hamlet just outside Athens. The doers of Greek society congregated around the Acropolis, raising taxes, waging war, whatever they were doing. The thinkers escaped to academe because they needed peace and quiet to operate in, away from the hurly-burly and heat of politics. In essence, academe was a place of refuge, an idealistic place disconnected from the realities of everyday life. What more can I say? And what about the ivory towers? The term originates from the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament and was applied to 19th century beautiful white towers in All Souls College in Oxford. Historically, academics wore gowns like clerics. Indeed, we still do for special ceremonies. And this is to make a statement that says, look at me. I couldn't possibly do manual work dressed like this. I'm different, I'm special. Compare this rarefied place with what Donald Schoen calls the swampy lowlands, the place that clinicians revel in occupying. Schoen beautifully described the dilemma of rigor and relevance, using the male pronoun, for which I apologize, in his book, The Reflective Practitioner, which is a brilliant book. You must read it if you haven't read it. He said, in the varied topography of professional practice, there's a high, hard ground overlooking a swamp. On the high ground, manageable problems lend themselves to solution through the use of research-based theory and technique. In the swampy lowlands, problems are messy and confusing and incapable of technical solution. The irony of this situation is the problems of the high ground tend to be relatively unimportant to individuals or society at large, however great their technical interest might be, while in the swamp lie the problems of greatest human concern. The practitioner is confronted with a choice. Shall he remain on the high, hard ground, where he can solve relatively unimportant problems according to his standard of rigor, or shall he descend to the swamp of important problems where he cannot be rigorous in any way he knows how to describe? What a beautiful description of the challenge that we have as both clinicians and academics. So there's our challenge. If we want research to have impact, and we all do, we need to close the gap between researchers and practitioners. One of the ways of doing this is to continue to support the kind of research that's being done in our universities, world-leading, methodologically rigorous, highly respected research. But to support them to be more focused on disseminating their research to those who want to use it to influence their practice. This requires researchers to be more planful about dissemination and influencing activities, to work with guidelines and guidance developers to make their findings more accessible, to summarize their key findings in ways that are attractive to time-poor clinicians. This is the information telling or knowledge transfer model, which is epitomized by the work of NICE and other guideline developers. And it's helped a lot to improve the dissemination of research. Researchers are in a much better place in doing this than they might have been in the past. So we need to do more of the same, respecting the work of our academic colleagues and communities, but we also need to think about how we could do things differently. And I want to highlight 3 ways in which I think we can break down the barriers between academia and practice in order to maximise the impact that research has on the NHS over the next decade. Two of these approaches are ones that are being used actively, led by the college now, as a facilitator and enabler of research activity in our specialty. First, I think we should embrace the recent move towards the use of big data to provide evaluative insights. This is often seen as complementary to research, to randomized controlled trials, but with a real-world focus. A case is increasingly made that big data may be cheaper, quicker, and more insightful replacement for experimental research. The move towards using big data represents a big conceptual shift in our understanding of the term evidence, and a shift in responsibility for building evidence from researchers to clinicians and managers. The term big data refers to large and complex data sets which can be analysed using self-updating algorithms which build predictive models by finding patterns in the data. They've come to prominence as a result of advances in computer technology and machine learning. The new clinical and administrative insights gained from linking databases are much greater in volume and speed than those provided by conventional research techniques. Of course, understanding the strengths and weaknesses and challenges, including data governance and ethical issues of big data sets, requires exceptional specialist research expertise. But big data also necessitates a high level of practitioner involvement than has traditionally been seen in research activity. Whether it be for understanding, diagnosis, treatment, or monitoring purposes, we can expect big data to dominate the research agenda for the foreseeable future, and I think it's going to be great to see the BJGP taking a lead in this area. My second suggestion is that we should engage more with participatory approaches towards research, in which the focus on reusing research to solve practical problems at pace. Participatory research, in which the traditional differentiation between research and practice is broken down, has been used for decades in the fields of education and community development, but much less so, much slower to take off in health, I guess because of our bioscientific, positivist, detached view of the world. Models of participatory research, such as the researcher in residence model or embedded research model, which I've been developing with colleagues over the last decade or so at UCL, have three defining characteristics. The first is that the researcher, rather than being based in a university, is based in a health service as an active member of an operational team, with responsibility for whether the team meets its objectives. The second is that the researcher brings a unique set of skills to the team: knowledge of evidence, theory, skills in evaluation and use of large amounts of data. Third, and most importantly, I think, their job is not just to inform their practitioner colleagues about the research findings, but to actively negotiate the meaning of research in practice. So this isn't about scientific knowledge being superior to all other forms of knowledge, like personal experience or intuition or authority, but about exploring how research evidence might interact with other ways of knowing favoured by practitioners. There's a growing number of research in residence or embedded research schemes across the UK, including an anthropologist working in a large hospital, helping them to develop clinical leadership, a modeler, an operational researcher working in a children's unit, helping them to improve flow through their theatres, and a political scientist working in general practice, helping GPs to work at scale. It's a flexible model, which early evidence suggests increases the engagement of practitioners with research, and which gets research more effectively into practice. The approach is looked down upon by some traditional researchers because but it's one possible way of ensuring that research continues to be important to the NHS over the next decade. Again, I'm hoping that sponsorship and support from a journal like the British Journal of General Practice will help to raise the utility and the profile of that kind of work. And thirdly and finally, my suggestion is that we need to engage more GPs and members of the primary healthcare team in contributing to the academic base of general practice. And this is being done through the college, through the WISE GP programme led by Joanne Reeve, who's in the audience. Joanne, hello, good to see you. Who's Professor of Primary Care Research at Hull York Medical School. The WISE GP programme is a joint initiative between the college and the Society for Academic Primary Care to champion the distinct scholarship which lies at the heart of person-centred general practice. It positions our specialty gently but unashamedly as a scholarly and intellectual one, as well as a practical one. The need is clear, given the evidence that medical students do not see general practice as an intellectually stimulating or demanding career choice, and that's one of the things that puts them off getting into general practice. This view is in stark contrast with the experience of us as experienced practitioners and the evidence from researchers that general practice is one of the most intellectually demanding of medical specialties. Scholarship is not about pointy-headedness. It's about the use of phronesis, practical wisdom, in interpreting evidence in a way that adds value to patient care. The challenge of the WISE GP programme is a fundamental one, that policies drive clinical practice to become more specified and more transactional, and the ability to be wise is increasingly challenged. The initiative is raising the profile of the issue, providing support and guidance, including providing a skills laboratory. There's some really exciting work going on here. It's about reclaiming scholarship from the rarefied world of academia. It's about democratizing scholarly expertise. It's about something, again, that I'd like to see the BJGP supporting. So in conclusion, my view is that research must become more important to the NHS in the next decade. The future of the NHS, indeed, is dependent on us doing so. Some of that importance will be realised through the model of university-based research that we've come to know and has progressed, and something that we should be proud of in the UK. But I've argued that in addition to this, we need to shift our mindset to embrace more practitioner-focused models of research, the use of big data, participatory models of research, and a stronger recognition of every GP as scholar. If we achieve this, then I'm confident that over the next decade, we can build the NHS into the most research-engaged health system in the world. Thanks very much for listening.